Welcome to Maine Quality. I'm your host, Orion Breen, and with me today is Brit Vitalius of Vitalius Real Estate Brokerage and president of the Southern Maine Landlord Association. So I wanted to hear your perspective, Brit, on affordable housing and what are the challenges and what can be done to bring more affordable housing to Southern Maine and Greater Portland and to the state of Maine in general.
Well, this is a huge topic and a hugely complex topic. So I'll try and keep my comments as linear as possible, but there's a lot of places we could jump in here. Southern Maine and the Greater Portland area is just facing the challenge that so many great, attractive cities are facing, which is with the growth and prosperity that we've experienced, that creates challenges. And so it winds up being this double-edged sword. We're sort of victims of our own success. So like so many communities, affordable housing is a challenge in Greater Portland. There are a lot of ways to deal with that, but first and foremost, you need to be able to build more housing. And that's a challenge. In a place like Portland, in a place like Maine, philosophically, people move to Maine for a quality of life that is not Florida, that's not Boston. They don't want a lot of traffic. They don't want a lot of development. And so we're here to be small, and yet to solve some of these challenges, we need to grow. And, in the world I inhabit as a broker, selling apartment buildings, selling houses, selling condos, and then representing landlords and seeing that whole political world. And rent control just passed recently here in Portland, so we can talk about that. You can just feel that tension, that people are excited that Portland and the area is growing and the restaurants, that people want to be here. It's really a very different community than it was growing up. And yet, it's now more expensive because more people want to live here. And so how do you manage that tension as a community? And in some ways, I think we're doing that well. In some ways, I think we're not doing that well, and we're vulnerable to sort of reactionary approach to these problems that may not be as thoughtful, that may not rise to the challenge of the thoughtfulness and nuance that housing challenges create.
What are some of the nuances from your perspective? There was some recent referendums, and it was kind of surprising that pretty much it seemed like everybody on the city council was opposed to a lot of the referendums or pieces of the referendums. But they passed anyway.
Well, I could talk a lot about the recent referendum and even the ones from 3 years ago. I was heavily involved with campaigns both times. This was a tough time to have an election this past year, this past November, on the local level with such complex referendum before the voters in a year that also saw one of the most expensive and important Senate races and the huge presidential race. Because of those state and national elections, there was really no ability to have a community discussion around the issues that were on the ballot. And these were complex issues. These were not just up and down, what flavor ice cream do you like? This was 20 pages of complex housing policy that got written by, one side, one special interest group with no input from the community, and done under some titles that sound very attractive, sound very non-controversial. And I believe that basically most folks in Portland didn't really understand what they were voting for. And the minimum wage is one great example. If you polled the average Portland voter and said, did you know that you were also voting for an $18 minimum wage that would actually go to $21 and it would be the highest in the nation? And do you think that small businesses in Portland and nonprofits in Portland can handle that right now in a pandemic? Do you have a thought about how many will close if you vote for this? I don't think that discussion was had as a community. And that's too bad because these are really important issues. Rent control went the same way. It was a tenants' rights bill. And some of the things in there are really counterintuitive and probably not even legal to do. And so there's going to be a whole mess there that gets flushed out. The Green New Deal is another one that passed. You talk to the average, left voter in Portland, and Portland is a rather progressive city. All our councilors are Democrats. And so the Green New Deal sounds great. It wasn't a Green New Deal. It wasn't about the environment. It was a housing bill. It changed the inclusionary zoning rate from 10% to 25%. That is a massive housing change. And the affordable housing community, some of whom have never taken a political stand, stepped up to say that this bill would be the worst thing for affordable housing. And back to affordable housing, the worst thing for affordable housing in Portland. But it was passed under the title of a Green New Deal. So that's a challenge that the city faces right now, is that you can bring forward referendums that sound wonderful, that sound like, apple pie and whatever the phrase is. And instead, they're actually getting through some agenda that even the folks trying to provide affordable housing are saying are terrible policy. So as a community, we've got to decide how to deal with that. Do we want policies that are this complex to just go to an up or down, yes or no vote? The city council came out and said no. The Portland Press Herald came out and said no. It's a hard discussion to have. Any conversation about it, and you'll be charged with being anti-democratic. And I think we need to rise above that as a community and be able to have intelligent conversation and debate without being castigated, called names, whatever.
Talked about the Green New Deal bill and that there is stuff in there that folks like Avesta Housing were concerned with, and what are the challenges there? What are the pieces of it that makes it more challenging?
So I'm not a developer, and I personally spent more time on the rent control part, so I could talk more about that. But high level in the Green New Deal, and without getting too wonky, it changed some of the labor requirements and labor rate requirements, is my understanding. That was at least one part of it, which then would put, so the way affordable housing gets funded, in part, it comes from Maine state housing, which gets, I think, money through HUD from the federal government. And then there's like a scorecard, and they've got a certain amount of money that they can hand out. And they look at the different communities around Maine and the different potential projects that are in front of them, and they get rated on a scorecard. Well, the Green New Deal would put the affordable housing projects in Portland at such a disadvantage that they would basically never get funded, that they would always cost too much relative to others. So Maine housing dollars wouldn't go as far if they were trying to build housing in Portland. So that's a very high level point. And I think what it does is illustrates how complex these issues are. It's not just, oh, go hire these kinds of workers. Oh, go make sure you have a green roof. That the way these things get funded are multiple layers and involve government agencies. And when you don't go through the public process, as slow as it is, as frustrating as it is, it's there for a reason. It's there so that the whole community can have their input. And the affordable housing folks can go, hey, I know that seems like a good idea, but this is how we actually get money. This is how that project down the street actually got built. And the folks making the rules can take that into account as they're crafting their policy. And the referendum process just completely bypasses that. So there's no community input. And there are all these unintended consequences. So it really is made in like this idealistic bubble with this nice title and this wish list of wouldn't it be wonderful if the world just worked like this? If people could just be paid more money and businesses didn't close, if we all just had green roofs, all this would be wonderful. But as a community, we've got to decide what our priorities are. And we've been hearing consistently that the priority is more affordable housing. Well, if that's really the priority, then we need to get all the stakeholders, folks like Dana Topman and others, Chom and Colin Ryan, these folks who have been doing this their whole career, working tirelessly for not a lot of money, building affordable housing. They're shut out of this discussion. That's just absurd. And Portland's going to pay a price, and it's going to pay it slowly and over time. And my concern is that people won't perceive it, that they won't realize all the buildings that are not being built. You don't feel that effect. You don't know what buildings are not here 10 years from now because this passed. You just know that the affordable housing problem is even worse than it was. And it was our attempted solutions that made it worse. And that's sad. Yeah, making policy as a wish list, wouldn't it be nice if everyone made $25 an hour? Great. But, it seems like this approach, comes from like a level of thinking where they're the big bad business owners and they're big and bad and they're actually just all hoarding their money and you just need to take more from them and give it to the good guys. And they don't think like, well, there are daycares that are struggling. There are nonprofits that are out there working hard to provide housing or services, addiction services, all these things. right, that are funded by the state, that have fixed funding. Did they have conversations with all those folks and think about all the impacts? We got to be better than this. We've got to engage with the community and not give it the straight arm and shut it out and think that one small group in the community has all the answers. We will not be successful if that's our approach as a community.
Let's talk about rent control, which you mentioned. As somebody who rented, one of the first reactions would be, oh, that'd be great. My rent doesn't go up. Cool. What are the negative aspects of rent control, or the way that rent control was implemented in Portland?
So this new rent control almost mandates or insists on landlords raising their rent every year. And if you talk to the average small landlord, most that I talk to don't actually raise their rent on existing tenants. And I don't know what your experience was, but I've got a lot of tenants and I know a lot of people who, you get a good tenant, they're happy, I'm happy, you might not raise their rent for 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, and that's just kind of the way it is. The new rent control creates an incentive to start going up every year because you're going to get left behind. It also creates this, so you can only raise a rent with Boston level consumer price index. So this year you could raise a rent 1.4%. If you turn the unit over, this is one part of this new Portland's rent control that's really counterintuitive and not what people knew from New York. With the new tenant, so your tenant leaves, they've been there 10 years, fine, they finally go off, buy a house, whatever, they leave. You're not free and clear. You can't just reset it. You can't renovate your unit and go up a couple $100. You can only go up 5%. Your $800 unit that you've been so kind, it was been $800 for 7 years. It's kind of tired, you need to fix it up, you can go up to $840. That's great. Thanks, landlord, for keeping the rent so low. Now you can go up $40. And in fact, it creates this perverse incentive because you can go up a little more if you actually kick the tenant out each year. At least you can get your 5%. You're not just tied to the consumer price index. If you want to renovate the unit and say, boy, I haven't touched the thing for 10 years, why don't I fix it up? And then maybe I can raise the rent more. What you have to do is you fix up the unit. You go try and renovate a unit for less than $10,000, less than $15,000, $20,000. Good luck. So let's say you're into it for $15,000. Now what you do is you spend the $15,000, you renovate the unit. Now you go before the Portland Rent Board, which is a volunteer board composed of no more than 3 landlords and at least 3 tenants. So that's who you're going to go to after you spent your $15,000, and you're going to ask them if you can increase the rent and by how much. They haven't been there. They didn't approve it ahead of time. You don't know what they're going to say. You've already spent the money. You're just hoping they give you a good increase. The most they could let you go up is 10% in any 1 year. So even if they're like, that's wonderful, different market, you're at 800, even though the market rent for a 1-bedroom might be $1,250, you're at 8, you can go up $80. So here you just spent $15,000. Now you can go from 800 to 880. Who's going to spend the $15,000? Nobody. Why would you do it? So rent-controlled cities, there's some great studies out about this now because there's been rent control in Cambridge, there's been rent control in San Francisco, and there's this exhaustive study that really looked at this. The Brookings Institute, which is a left-leaning think tank, has a great summary of the study. And it shows that it basically does all the opposite things that you would think rent control would accomplish. It actually increases the disparity between the high rents and the low rents. It reduces the amount of housing, deteriorates housing stock, and even lowers values on surrounding communities. So it just doesn't do what people want it to do. It's one of those, it's simple, it sounds good, let's just tinker with one thing, just don't raise rents. And the problem with life is that it's complicated. And policies and humans are complicated, and everything's bumping into everything else. And so the unintended consequences are worse than the positives. And now Portland has to deal with it.
If you had your druthers, what policies would you like to see on a local or state level that would actually help affordable housing?
There's some great programs going on right now. And I think part of it is that we just don't have good press. We started after the last rent control campaign, me and a couple other Port Properties, Tom Watson from Port Properties, Jonathan Colley, and Dana Topman. So we had the biggest affordable housing developer, the biggest landlord, the biggest market rate developer, and myself started a group called the Quality Housing Coalition. And what we've been doing is bringing tenants who would have a hard time qualifying for market rate housing into market rate housing. And we created this alternate path where even if they don't have a credit score, or even if they don't have the income, it's an alternate path that companies like Port Properties, which actually have to have a very strict, consistent application process and qualifications, or they get dragged into court, it allows them to take some of these tenants. And the program has been wildly successful. I think we've housed 60 families already in the first year. Our cost per housing is low. We've got the ongoing housing mentoring and coaching. And we've affiliated with a whole bunch of programs that were already out there: shelters, addiction recovery, new immigrant programs, new Mainer programs, and getting these folks into good market rate housing. So we're expanding the pool of housing that is available to these folks. It's not just Avesta and Shalom and Portland housing. We're opening up market rate housing because we put some systems in place. Now that's the private sector doing that, because we saw what the problems were. That when you took a tenant who is new to this country and they weren't familiar with how to use the systems and all the features of a modern apartment and cold climate and everything, that there were challenges that a market rate landlord just couldn't handle. He just couldn't keep up with. And we've addressed those specifically and creating just a ton of successes. And it's really great to see. So that's one example of the kind of thing that already is happening. There is a lot of affordable housing being built, I think more this year than any other year. And hundreds of units going up in Portland right now, but it's not splashed all over the paper. So you get one group saying, oh, there's no affordable housing, and they do something to basically shut it down. You're like, no, look over here. There's a lot actually being built. And there's this other program going on helping people get into housing. So those are a couple of things that are already happening that are positives. The other point that I would want to make is affordable housing clearly is a concern for the community. We polled 3 years ago in the last rent control campaign, and the number one concern of people living in Portland was affordable housing, period. Yet, every time a new housing development tries to go in, particularly off the peninsula, but even on the peninsula, the neighbors rise up and say, not in my backyard. Oh, I care about affordable housing, but not here. And there's a church out on Pleasant Ave, out past Woodford's Corner, that was supposed to be 25 units for affordable housing. And the neighbors came out and said, not in my backyard. This is a quiet residential community. You guys go do that in your big city. We're not a city out here. And they became higher end apartments, because although a community says they care about affordable housing, when push comes to shove and a project's going to go in, they say, we don't want it here. We need to have a reckoning about that. And we need to have those conversations publicly, because it has to go somewhere. And if we don't want it, we don't want it. Fine. But then stop pretending as a community that we do, or stop doing the clear your conscience solution because you just voted rent control, but you didn't let the housing go in down the street. That's BS, in my opinion. You care about it, then we need more housing. If you don't, then fine, don't pretend. So that's a little bit of my rant here. But I think as a community, you can't have your cake and eat it too. You've got to embrace affordable. You've got to embrace the fact that we're growing as a city, and the more wealthy and the affordable who are not need to be able to coexist in this community. And that even if you live off the peninsula, you still live in a city. You might not like to think it, but you still live in a city. And we've got to be comfortable with growth. And if we're not, it's just going to get more expensive.
Yeah, I saw a map of the region that GPCOG put together, and it was shocking, really, how much in Greater Portland there was on zoning limits on multifamily housing. And if you think about traffic and transportation and the environment and affordability, all these things are saying, having a 2-acre lot with a 1-family house is not the best way to live if you care about the environment, transportation, traffic, and affordable housing. Yet we're not allowing any development, of saying, hey, we have seniors, we have families, we have people of all income ranges. Let's make transportation hubs and higher density living areas so that you have walkable streets, and you create these neighborhoods, and actually, decreases traffic because it's worth putting in a bus stop there. So there's all this smart planning we could do, but we have all these, we have NIMBYism, we have zoning regulations that are outdated, that people have written about how they're discriminatory, that it is like the modern day redlining is with some of these zoning rules that don't allow multifamily units.
It's a real challenge. It's huge. I think Portland started making some headway with that when Jeff Levine was the head of planning in Portland. I think he got it, and he did some upzoning in R6, and we started infilling a lot of lots downtown. That was not disruptive. It was already in a dense area, and they were kind of conforming to what was around them. So that was very smartly done. I think they've upzoned some of the corridors or created some incentives in the corridors, the Forest Aves and Brighton Ave. So I think they've started tackling the right things. And to your point, people do kind of know what we have to do. They know that housing is also a transportation issue. And as you alluded to earlier, this really is a community issue. Portland is a community of towns. We're not going to solve all of housing just in Portland. There's more housing being built in South Portland and Scarborough and Westbrook right now than there is in Portland. Well, that's great. That's how cities grow. You go down to Boston, you probably don't actually live in Boston. You live in Somerville or Cambridge or Brookline or whatever. That's how cities work. Transportation is a part of that. And I think we're still sort of, maybe not even teenagers yet as a growth of the city and struggling with our bus lines. And can Portland's transit system work with South Portland's? And can we start talking about housing even as a community? Portland makes one set of rules, South Portland makes another set, Westbrook makes a different set. Maybe there's a bus that connects them. We think in terms of towns here in New England, and that will be a challenge. We're not coming at the problem from a more holistic perspective. And so in Portland, the city councilors or the referendums trying to just solve the problem in Portland, as opposed to us all talking about it as a county or a community. And I don't have a good answer on how to solve that. It's embedded in our school systems and everything else, our identities, our governance. So that's a tough one.
So how did you get started in this work?
Well, I grew up in Yarmouth, so I'm a lifelong Mainer and love it, and have moved back there to raise my family and live in the best place in the world. But I got into investing in real estate for a brief period of time when I was living down in Miami, which I say I might as well have been on the moon coming from Maine, being in Miami. But bought my first investment property, decided I really liked it more than computer programming and the things I'd done before. So when I moved back to Maine, I got my real estate license and just started in real estate, mostly as a broker, but we've acquired some properties over time. And I love the people aspect of what we do, that it's engaged with the community. My career really is centered around apartment buildings. And so that sort of brought me to the Landlord Association, and I eventually became president of the Landlord Association. The Landlord Association is basically an educational group. I haven't missed a meeting in over 10 years. I run every meeting, and we bring people out to educate our members on how to be better landlords, how to deal with lead paint, how to deal with bed bugs. We've had the human rights folks out and the radon folks, and we really work hard on being good landlords and understanding the laws. And then you go listen to the media, and they make us out like we're the biggest, worst group ever, just trying to abuse tenants who we see as our clients, who we depend on, who we take care of. So it's a real disconnect from the world we live in, taking care of our tenants and trying to do it well and respectfully. And there's not a lot of money in owning apartment buildings, I got to tell you. I don't know until you get a lot of units. These things cost a lot more than they make. These 100-year-old buildings we all own. We're out there doing a good job trying to learn how to be good landlords and educate ourselves and share the knowledge and just be a network. And then we just start getting attacked as rent control stuff and demonized in the media and by certain groups. Feel free to go on the SMLA's Facebook page. I think you can see some comments where the scum of the earth. I mean, this is pretty extreme rhetoric out there. Most recently, threatening to come to my house to try and scare me out of town, basically threatening me until I either leave or shut up. So for those of us who are involved in housing and providing housing, I think we just mostly try to keep our head down, do what we do, take care of our buildings, take care of our tenants, and let our actions speak. And maybe every once in a while get a little good press out of it to help combat the attacks we have to take every day.
You don't see too many newspaper reporters saying, I want to do an article about a nice landlord.
Right. Yeah, nobody wants to hear that.
So there's like affordable housing vouchers, and I've been learning a little bit about them. They have a lot of rules and regulations that are well-intentioned, but then if you have to jump through all these hoops in order to rent somebody who has a voucher, where's the incentive? to do it if you can just rent it to somebody without a voucher for the same price or even more?
Yeah, that's a real challenge. And it was particularly bad a few years ago when the rents were increasing at a rate that was faster than the amount paid by these voucher programs could pay. So you might have a tenant in the market pay $1,200 for an apartment, but Section 8 would only pay $1,100. Well, that's never going to work because, to your point, you take maybe some extra inspections and things you've got to deal with the voucher program, and they can't pay as much. So there was a time where that was really a problem. I do an annual report every year on the multifamily market in Southern Maine. And starting last year, I talked about this at the Merida Forecast Conference, where they've actually caught up. And so it's good. And in some cases, you may be able to get a voucher tenant who pays even more. So there may be, at this point in time, a real incentive for landlords who do want to try and open up their units to tenants who might have a harder time getting an apartment. This might be a good time to consider it. Yes, there's some extra inspections. Yes, it's another wrinkle. I guess I would say I've been through them. They're not particularly onerous. So I think it's actually a good time for landlords to consider that. And I would say, and the agencies would say, you still have to vet them like you would any other tenant. A woman at Portland Housing just told me this a couple of weeks ago, and I believe it. They tend to stay longer than other tenants. Many folks on a voucher will stay on that voucher for a long time, and they will stay. You are really providing housing. So there is a stability that when you get a good, Section 8 tenant, as an example, that's really a wonderful situation. You're providing housing, stable housing. They stay for a long time. If the rent's at a market rate, you're probably doing as well as you do with anyone else. That's a great situation.
What do you see as the biggest challenges or opportunities in Maine?
I think the opportunities, particularly in COVID times, is, Maine was already an attractive place for people to come. And it is that times 10 right now. And so I think that's an opportunity. We're going to get some other brilliant folks, some folks who really work at a high level, some great brain power and some good income is going to move to this state. And we should figure out how to harness that and use them and keep them here locally. They want to be here. They're choosing Maine for a reason. They like our lifestyle. They like our values. So let's figure out how to take that as a positive and not just have this sort of knee-jerk reaction as, oh, I don't want more people from Massachusetts or out-of-staters or whatever. That's not helpful.
Is there anything we haven't touched on that you'd like to talk about?
Ultimately, I want to leave with a positive message, which is I think we're really so fortunate that we really are doing so many things right. A lot of good things are actually happening every day and a lot of good people. Keep supporting it, keep being positive, keep engaged, and let's all just focus on constructive dialogue, engaging with reality, engaging with truth. This is the glue that's going to hold us together as a species. And if we do that, I think we're going to survive and continue to thrive.
You're listening to Maine Quality. I'm your host, Orion Breen, and with us today was Brit Vitalius of Vitalius Real Estate Brokerage and president of the Southern Maine Landlord Association. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks so much for having me. This is great.